Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a slow, sleepy walk through ancient Rome. So dim the lights. Put your phone down. Get comfortable. Maybe imagine you're lying on a marble couch in a Roman villa, listening to distant crowds that you don't actually need to care about. Tonight's topic is gladiators. But not the loud, heroic, cinematic kind. Not the dramatic slow-motion sword fights. Instead, we're focusing on the quieter part of their lives. The awkward, uncertain, slightly depressing question of what happened after the arena stopped calling their name. Because movies love to show the battle. They don't love to show retirement paperwork, aching joints, and financial regret. But that's where the real Roman story lives. So let's drift into it. Gladiators were, at their core, professional fighters. But also entertainers. And also, very often, property. They were trained in special schools called ludi, run by trainers known as lanisti. Which is just a polite Latin way of saying man who owns fighters and profits from them. Some gladiators were slaves. Some were prisoners of war. Some were criminals sentenced to fight. And some, because humans are fascinatingly reckless, volunteered. Yes. Volunteers. People who signed contracts saying, sure, I'd like to risk death for fame and maybe a nice helmet. Rome, of course, loved them. Crowds adored the drama. Poets wrote about them. Women allegedly swooned over them. They were the celebrities of their era. Just with fewer brand deals and more stab wounds. But even celebrities get tired. Even warriors age. And eventually, a gladiator either died or survived long enough to retire. Retirement was possible. Rare, but possible. A successful gladiator could be granted a wooden sword called a rudis. This symbolized freedom. It was basically Rome saying, congrats, you survived. Please stop bleeding on our sand. But freedom didn't mean comfort. And it definitely didn't mean a pension plan. So, what did retired gladiators actually do? Well, their lives often took strange, ironic turns. Some became trainers. After all, if you've survived years of being chased by men with tridents, you probably know a thing or two about combat. Former fighters could return to the training schools, teaching new recruits how to dodge, strike, and emotionally prepare for public judgment. Imagine that job interview. Yes, I survived 12 arena matches. Great, can you teach teenagers how not to die? Others became bodyguards. Roman politicians loved hiring ex-gladiators for protection. It looked impressive. And intimidating. And also slightly ironic, because these were men once owned by the state. Now guarding the men who ran it. Some retired fighters found work as performers. They toured smaller towns. Put on mock battles. Signed autographs, well, metaphorical autographs. Rome didn't have Sharpies, but the vibe was similar. And then there were the less glamorous paths. Some gladiators opened taverns. Which sounds charming. Until you imagine a former arena warrior now arguing about wine prices with customers who think they could have fought better. Others became laborers, dock workers, construction workers, manual jobs that paid little and offered even less dignity. And many ended up simply poor. Because fame in Rome was fleeting. Crowds moved on quickly. New fighters arrived. New scandals replaced old ones. Yesterday's champion became today's trivia question. There's also evidence that some retired gladiators ended up in brothels. Not necessarily by choice. Their bodies were commodities. Their reputations made them desirable. And Rome, being Rome, commercialized everything. It's a strangely tragic transition. From arena idol to marketed fantasy. Some gladiators tried to capitalize on their fame. They sold memorabilia. Sweat. Yes. Actual sweat. Roman women believed gladiator sweat had cosmetic benefits. It was scraped off their bodies and sold as beauty products. Because nothing says luxury skincare like recycled warrior moisture. And while that sounds almost comedic, it hints at a deeper reality. Gladiators were admired, but rarely respected. They were symbols of strength, but socially low-ranking. Famous, yet disposable. Even after retirement, many Romans still saw them as morally questionable. Not quite respectable citizens. Not quite outcasts. Just stuck in a weird middle space. Like celebrities who never quite escaped their scandal. Some gladiators, of course, tried to settle down. They married. Had children. Attempted normal domestic lives. Which must have been an adjustment. Imagine explaining to your kids. Yes, Dad used to fight people for entertainment. Please pass the bread. A few retired fighters became surprisingly wealthy. Prize money could be substantial for successful stars. Some invested in property. Some started businesses. Some lived relatively comfortable lives. But they were the exceptions. The lucky ones. The statistical anomalies. Most gladiators had short careers. Injuries were common. Chronic pain was basically guaranteed. There was no Roman physical therapy program. No government health care. Just sore joints, and fading applause. And there's something quietly haunting about that. They trained their entire lives for violence. Their identities revolved around combat. Then suddenly, they were expected to exist peacefully in a society that never fully accepted them. It's a bit like being a celebrity after your show gets cancelled. Except your show involved swords. Some retired gladiators struggled emotionally. The arena had given them purpose. Structure. Attention. Afterward, there was silence. No roaring crowd. No dramatic entrances. No adrenaline. Just regular life. Which, compared to the arena, must have felt strangely dull. Others missed the fame so much that they returned. Yes. Returned to fighting. Even after earning freedom. Even after surviving. Some re-enlisted, drawn back by money, pride, or the simple inability to imagine another life. Rome loved a comeback story. And it loved watching someone risk everything, again. It's also worth noting that some gladiators never truly escaped exploitation. They might technically be free, but still indebted, still pressured, still economically trapped. Freedom in Rome often came with fine print. Now, let's gently zoom out for a moment. Gladiators weren't just fighters. They were part of a massive entertainment system. The arena was like a combination of sports league, reality show, and political distraction. Emperors used games to win popularity. Bread and circuses, as the phrase goes. Feed the people. Entertain them. Keep them from asking inconvenient questions. And gladiators were the stars of that system. But systems rarely take care of their stars once they're no longer profitable. Sound familiar? Of course it does. Some retired gladiators tried to reinvent themselves socially. They joined local communities, participated in religious cults, made donations to temples, basically saying, "Please see me as a normal citizen now." But Roman society had long memories and long prejudices. Even free gladiators could be barred from certain honors. Their past followed them, like a permanent reputation scar. Still, a few became local legends, especially in smaller towns. The former arena champion. The man who once faced death and lived. Children might have listened wide-eyed. Adults nodded respectfully. Stories grew exaggerated, as stories always do. And over time, the blood, fear, and trauma softened into myth. But not everyone aged into myth. Some retired gladiators ended up homeless, forgotten, dying quietly without ceremony. No roaring crowds. No triumphant exit. Just another body in an empire full of bodies. It's not the glamorous ending people imagine. And that's sort of the point. Gladiators symbolize spectacle, strength, drama. But their retirement reveals something more mundane, more human, more uncomfortable. They were workers. Exploited workers. Entertainers whose value faded once their bodies wore out. Their afterlives weren't filled with glory. They were filled with jobs, bills, pain, memories, and occasionally, regret. Now let's drift toward a specific example. Not a loud heroic one. Just a quietly fascinating figure. There was a gladiator named Flamma, a Syrian fighter who became extremely popular in Rome. He reportedly fought dozens of matches, won many, and was offered freedom multiple times. Multiple times. And each time, he refused. Why? Possibly because being a gladiator, dangerous as it was, gave him status, income, and identity. Outside the arena, he might have been just another foreigner. Inside it, he was a star. Eventually, though, even Flamma died in the arena. Retirement never came. And that's another silent reality. Many gladiators never lived long enough to even ask what retirement looked like. Those who did faced a strange second act. Some embraced quiet lives. Some chased lingering fame. Some struggled. Some failed. And Rome, in its classic fashion, mostly didn't care. Because there was always another fighter. Another spectacle. Another name for the crowd to chant. Let's let that settle for a moment. The idea that glory can be loud. But aging is quiet. That survival doesn't guarantee comfort. That applause fades faster than scars. Now, let's gently float forward. In the next part, we'll look more closely at how retired gladiators navigated love, reputation, scandal, and their awkward transformation from violent celebrities into ordinary, slightly broken Roman men. For now, just rest in the slow hum of history. The soft echo of sandals on marble. And the distant sound of a crowd that no longer matters. Alright, let's settle back in. If your eyes are getting heavy, that's perfect. Tonight, we're not rushing anywhere. We're just drifting, gently, through the quieter corners of Roman history. Last time, we talked about what happened to gladiators after the arena stopped cheering for them. Now let's slide into something even softer. Their personal lives. Their romances. Their reputations. And their slightly uncomfortable attempts to live like normal people. Because being a retired gladiator wasn't just about finding a job. It was also about figuring out how to exist. After being a public spectacle, gladiators were strange celebrities. They were admired, but also looked down upon. Desired, but not fully respected. Famous, but socially awkward to bring to formal dinner parties. And when they retired, that fame didn't just disappear overnight. It lingered. Sometimes as admiration. Sometimes as gossip. Sometimes as a burden. Roman women, in particular, had a fascination with gladiators. There are poems, graffiti, and writings that suggest they were considered incredibly attractive. Rugged. Dangerous. Masculine. A little forbidden. You can almost imagine the whispers. Oh, that's him, the one who fought with the net and trident. Because of course Rome had its own version of fan culture. Some retired gladiators leaned into this. They became local heartthrobs. They enjoyed attention. They enjoyed romance. They enjoyed the strange thrill of being remembered. But fame is tricky. It doesn't always lead to stability. A gladiator might be admired, but not necessarily welcomed into elite society. Marrying into a respectable family could be difficult. Parents might hesitate. After all, this man used to fight for money in front of screaming crowds. What kind of dinner conversation would that bring? Still, some gladiators did settle down. They formed families. Had children. tried to build legacies that weren't centered on violence. Imagine that shift. From calculating how to survive a duel, to calculating household expenses. From sharpening swords, to fixing roof tiles. It must have felt surreal. And then there were the gladiators who struggled with reputation. Because even after retirement, many Romans still saw them as morally questionable. Their past in the arena marked them as people who had participated in bloodshed for entertainment. They were admired, but also quietly judged. Some towns might have celebrated them. Others might have kept them at arm's length. A kind of polite distance. Not hatred. Just hesitation. And that hesitation shaped their lives. There are inscriptions that show former gladiators donating money to public buildings or temples. Partly generosity. Partly image management. It's the ancient version of saying, "Look, I'm respectable now. Please update my reputation." Some gladiators joined local religious groups or social clubs. Trying to integrate. Trying to belong. And some, unfortunately, leaned into their darker reputations. A few retired fighters became involved in crime. Not because it was glamorous, but because physical strength and a fearsome reputation could be monetized. Debt collection. Intimidation. Guard work that leaned a little toward extortion. It's not surprising. If society won't fully accept you, sometimes you stop trying to impress it. But let's not paint them all as tragic or morally gray. Some actually found peace. There are hints of former gladiators becoming farmers. Tending land. Raising animals. Watching seasons pass instead of opponents. That's a striking contrast. One day, you're fighting for your life in front of thousands. The next, you're worrying about olive harvests. And honestly, that sounds kind of soothing. Some probably preferred the quiet. No crowds. No pressure. No betting odds. Just routine. But not everyone adjusted easily. A lot of gladiators likely struggled with injuries. Chronic pain. Scars that pulled when they moved. Old fractures that never healed properly. Rome didn't offer much in the way of medical care for aging fighters. Once you were no longer profitable, you were largely on your own. Which meant some retirees lived with constant discomfort. Trying to work. Trying to stay useful. Trying to pretend their bodies weren't worn down by years of combat. And then there's the emotional side. The arena gave structure. Training schedules. Competition. Attention. A sense of identity. Retirement meant losing all of that. Suddenly. No more applause. No more adrenaline. No more spotlight. For some, that quiet must have felt peaceful. For others, empty. There are modern parallels, of course. Athletes who retire and struggle. Celebrities who miss fame. People who don't know who they are without their former careers. Gladiators likely felt something similar. Some might have told the same stories over and over. About their best fights. Their closest calls. Their victories. A little nostalgic. A little repetitive. A little stuck in the past. And honestly, that's very human. Now, let's drift toward another interesting role retired gladiators sometimes took. Politics. Not major imperial politics, usually. But local influence. Town recognition. Community roles. A famous former gladiator could hold sway in a small city. People recognized them. Listened to them. Respected their reputation for strength and endurance. They might be invited to local events. Asked to judge contests. Used as symbolic figures of courage. It's a softer, quieter form of power. No swords. No sand. Just name recognition. But that influence could also attract trouble. Old rivals. Jealous individuals. People trying to provoke them into proving they still had it. Which must have been exhausting. Imagine trying to live peacefully, while strangers constantly remind you of your violent past. Some gladiators leaned into nostalgia. Others tried to forget it entirely. And some couldn't escape it. There are stories of retired fighters being pulled back into the arena. Sometimes willingly. Sometimes under pressure. A desperate promoter might say, "Come on, one more fight. The crowd misses you." And maybe the money was too tempting. Or the pride. Or the habit. So they returned. Older. Slower. But still expected to perform like legends. It rarely ended beautifully. Aging gladiators were less agile. More vulnerable. More likely to lose. And losing in the arena could mean death. Or at least humiliation. A cruel fate. To survive long enough to retire. Only to risk it all again. But Rome loved drama. And tragedy. And spectacle. So it kept calling them back. Now let's gently zoom out again. Gladiators weren't just individuals. They were symbols. Symbols of violence. Symbols of entertainment. Symbols of how far an empire would go to amuse itself. And when those symbols aged out of usefulness, they were quietly discarded. That's the uncomfortable undercurrent of their retirement stories. They gave their bodies, their health, their lives. And in return, they got temporary fame. Then silence. Some managed to carve out peaceful second acts. Others drifted into obscurity. Some struggled. Some thrived. But none truly escaped the shadow of the arena. Even in old age, people likely remembered them as fighters first. Not farmers. Not husbands. Not fathers. Just gladiators. And there's something oddly sad about that. Now, let's spend a little time imagining a typical retired gladiator's day. Not the cinematic kind. Just a quiet, ordinary one. He wakes up early. His joints ache. He stretches slowly. Maybe he owns a small shop. Or works on a farm. Or trains younger fighters. He eats a simple meal. Bread. Olives. Wine diluted with water. Someone recognizes him on the street. Nods. Asks about the old days. He smiles politely. Tells a story he's told 100 times. Later, he rests. Watching the afternoon light shift across the walls. In the evening, he might sit with family. Or alone. Thinking about the noise that used to surround him. No cheering now. No roaring crowds. Just quiet. That's retirement. Not glamorous. Not heroic. Just human. And honestly, that's more interesting than endless battle scenes. Now, as we drift forward, we'll begin to explore some specific case studies. Individual gladiators whose post-arena lives give us glimpses into this strange transition. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just gently revealing. We'll look at how some became respected locals. How others faded into financial trouble. And how a few tried, sometimes awkwardly, to stay famous long after the crowds moved on. For now, let your mind rest on the softer side of Roman history. The afterlife of fame. The quiet after applause. The slow, steady rhythm of ordinary days. Hey guys, tonight we're drifting into a soft, misty corner of medieval Europe. So dim the lights. Get comfortable. Let your mind slow down a little, like a candle flame flickering in a quiet stone cottage. Tonight's topic is witches. Not the loud, dramatic, pointy-hat movie kind. Not the screeching villains flying through stormy skies. Instead, we're going to explore the calmer, stranger, slightly awkward reality behind one very specific question. Did medieval witches really fly on broomsticks? Short answer, not exactly. Long answer, is much weirder, much sleepier, and honestly far more fascinating. So let's gently float into it. When people imagine medieval witches, they often picture old women soaring through the night on brooms, silhouetted against the moon. It's dramatic. It's theatrical. And it's very good for Halloween decorations. But medieval life was rarely that exciting. Most so-called witches were ordinary people. Often women. Often poor. Often living quiet, unremarkable lives. They might have been healers. Midwives. Herbalists. Or just socially awkward neighbors who owned a suspicious number of cats. In a world full of superstition, famine, disease, and unexplained misfortune, someone always had to take the blame. And sometimes, that someone was labeled a witch. Now, the broomstick image didn't appear out of nowhere. Brooms were common household objects. They symbolized domestic life. Cleaning. Routine. Chores. Not exactly the glamorous tool of a magical rebel. But over time, folklore and fear transformed this everyday item into something mystical. There were stories of women who could travel at night, move invisibly, slip through villages unseen. And eventually, storytellers needed a visual, a way to imagine how they did it. So, broomsticks entered the chat. Because if you're inventing magical transportation in medieval Europe, why not use the thing already leaning against the wall? But here's where things get quietly strange. Some historical records suggest that the idea of witches flying might not have come from literal flight, but from altered states of consciousness. In other words, it might have been more about feeling like you were flying. There were certain herbal mixtures used in medieval folk medicine. Plants like belladonna, henbane, and mandrake. All of them mildly to extremely hallucinogenic. These herbs could cause vivid dreams, sensations of floating, out-of-body experiences, a gentle drifting feeling, like rising into the air. If applied to the skin, these substances could create intense visions, including the sensation of traveling great distances. Now imagine someone experiencing that in a dimly lit medieval home. No science, no psychology, just a powerful dreamlike state. It might feel like flying, not literally soaring through the clouds, but floating through imagination. And over time, those stories, those sensations, those rumors, could evolve into legends of broomstick flight. Because medieval Europe loved a good rumor, and loved an even better moral panic. Now let's slow down and think about the social side. The Middle Ages were full of fear. Fear of illness. Fear of bad harvests. Fear of storms. Fear of unexplained tragedies. When something went wrong, people wanted a reason. Witches became convenient explanations. A cow stopped producing milk. Probably witchcraft. A child fell ill. Suspicious. Bad weather ruined crops. Clearly supernatural interference. And once witch hunts began, stories about witches grew more elaborate. They weren't just neighbors anymore. They became creatures of the night. Secret flyers. Potion makers. Mysterious travelers. And yes, broomstick pilots. During interrogations, accused witches were often pressured to confess. They might repeat stories they'd heard, or describe dreams, or invent details to satisfy authorities. Some confessions included tales of flying to secret gatherings, to forests, to mountaintops, to imagined meetings with other supposed witches. These accounts were recorded, not because they were true, but because authorities wanted them to be. And over time, those recorded fantasies shaped popular belief. The idea of witches flying became part of folklore. Then art. Then literature. Then eventually, pop culture. All from a blend of fear, rumor, and human imagination. There's something oddly poetic about that. A simple household broom, transformed into a symbol of supernatural travel. Now let's gently talk about how this idea spread visually. Artists in Europe began depicting witches in paintings and prints. Sometimes riding animals. Sometimes riding mythical creatures. And eventually, riding brooms. These images weren't neutral. They were meant to frighten. To warn. To reinforce the idea that witches were dangerous and otherworldly. A broomstick in art wasn't just transportation. It became a visual shorthand for, this woman is suspicious. And over time, that image stuck. Even when witch trials faded. Even when belief in witches softened. The broom image remained. It lingered in fairy tales, children's stories, seasonal decorations, and late-night costume parties. A strange legacy for a household cleaning tool. But let's float back to the people behind the myth. Many women accused of witchcraft were socially vulnerable. Widows. Elderly women. Outcasts. People who didn't fit in. They might have had knowledge of herbs. Or midwifery. Or simply strong personalities. In a rigid society, that could be dangerous. And when they were accused, their lives often became quiet tragedies. Not dramatic villains. Not magical masterminds. Just ordinary humans caught in extraordinary fear. The idea that these women were soaring through the night is almost absurdly far from their real lives. Most were probably more concerned with daily chores than nighttime sky travel. But myth rarely cares about reality. Myth prefers exaggeration. Now, let's gently explore another layer. There's also a theory that broom-flying stories had symbolic meanings. Some scholars suggest that flying represented escaping social constraints, leaving behind domestic expectations, feeling free, even briefly. In a society where women's lives were often restricted, the fantasy of flight could feel powerful. A metaphor for independence, or imagination, or simply dreaming of something beyond daily routine. So maybe witches didn't literally fly. But the idea of them flying reflected deeper desires and fears. Desires for freedom. Fears of women stepping outside social roles. Because history often says more about society's anxieties than about actual magic. Now, let's slow things down even more. Imagine a medieval village at night. No streetlights. No electric hum. Just darkness. And distant candlelight. Someone hears a strange sound. A creaking door. A rustling bush. It's easy to imagine something supernatural. When the world feels mysterious. Mystery fills the gaps. And in that environment, a rumor about a neighbor flying on a broom could feel believable. Not because it was logical, but because fear made it feel real. Stories spread. Details grew. Exaggerations piled up. And eventually, a legend was born. There's also a gentle irony here. Brooms were associated with women's domestic labor. Sweeping. Cleaning. Keeping house. Turning a broom into a magical vehicle almost feels like a strange rebellion. Taking a symbol of daily chores and transforming it into something mystical. Like saying, "Yes, I sweep floors, but in legend, I soar." Of course, real medieval women likely didn't see it that way. They were more focused on survival than symbolism. But the cultural transformation happened anyway. Now let's take a soft detour into folklore. Different regions had different witch stories. Some talked about flying ointments. Others about shape-shifting. Others about secret nighttime journeys. Broomsticks weren't universal at first. They gradually became the dominant image over centuries. Which reminds us that traditions evolve. Myths merge. Images change. What we think of as classic witch imagery is actually the result of long cultural layering. A slow build-up of fear, fantasy, and artistic repetition. Now, one more calming thought. There's no reliable historical evidence that anyone actually flew on a broomstick. No verified eyewitness accounts. No physical proof. What we do have are records of beliefs. Confessions under pressure. Stories told and retold. In other words, we're studying the psychology of a culture, not the physics of magical flight. And that makes the topic oddly soothing. Because it's less about monsters, and more about human imagination. Fear. Rumor. Creativity. Misunderstanding. Soft, messy, very human forces. Now let's gently summarize this feeling, without actually summarizing. Witches didn't likely soar through the sky. But people believed they might. And belief shaped laws. Art. Stories. And centuries of cultural memory. A broom became a symbol. A myth became a tradition. A rumor became a costume. And here we are. Hundreds of years later. Still talking about it. Still imagining it. Still half believing it, in a playful, storybook way. Now, as your mind drifts, let's prepare to float into part 2. Next time, we'll explore specific medieval cases. Real historical individuals. Their confessions. Their rumors. And how ordinary lives slowly transformed into legendary witch tales. For now, let your thoughts slow. Like dust settling on an old wooden broom. Quiet. Soft. Still. Alright, let's gently drift back in. No sudden noises. No dramatic revelations. Just soft medieval rumors, and people trying to make sense of a confusing world. In part 1, we explored how broom flying probably wasn't a real thing, but rather a mix of folklore, fear, hallucinations, and imagination. Now let's float closer to the actual people behind the stories. Not the fairy tale witches. Not the cartoon villains. But real medieval men and women who were quietly living their lives. Until society decided they were magical. Because most witches were not dramatic. They weren't flying. They weren't casting lightning bolts. They were usually just neighbors. Let's imagine a typical accused witch. She might be older, perhaps widowed, living alone, a little poor, a little outspoken, a little different. Maybe she knew how to use herbs, or helped deliver babies, or simply had a sharp tongue. In a world where many things were mysterious, difference could feel dangerous. If a crop failed, someone needed to blame. If a child became sick, someone needed to accuse. If a marriage failed, someone had to be responsible. And slowly, quietly, the finger pointed at her. Not because she flew, but because people were afraid. Now here's where the flying stories start to sneak in. During witch trials, accused people were often pressured to confess. Not gently, not kindly, but persistently. Authorities wanted stories. They wanted dramatic accounts. They wanted evidence of supernatural behavior. So they asked leading questions. Did you travel at night? Did you attend secret gatherings? Did you ride through the air? And under stress, under fear, under exhaustion. Some people agreed. They might describe dreams, visions, fantasies, or simply repeat rumors they'd already heard. Over time, those confessions were written down, preserved, copied, and suddenly, the idea of witches flying felt documented. But documentation doesn't always equal truth. Sometimes it just records what people were pressured to say. Now let's gently talk about those herbal mixtures again. Some folk healers used ointments made from psychoactive plants. Not because they wanted to fly, but because they wanted pain relief, or sleep, or spiritual visions. Applied to the skin, these mixtures could create sensations of floating, drifting, leaving the body. Someone might lie down, close their eyes, and feel as though they were traveling through the night. Later, if questioned, they might describe it as flying. Not because they physically left the ground, but because it felt like they did. And in a medieval world without neuroscience, that could easily become magic. Now let's look at how these stories spread socially. Village gossip traveled slowly, but it traveled far. Someone hears a rumor. They tell a neighbor. The neighbor exaggerates it slightly. Someone else adds a detail. By the time it reaches another town, the woman who once used herbs is now reportedly soaring over rooftops. That's how folklore grows. Not in explosions, but in soft, steady whispers. And those whispers shaped public imagination. Now let's gently introduce a real historical flavor. In the 15th and 16th centuries, witch hunting manuals appeared. Books written by men who were very confident in their own authority. One famous example is the Malleus Maleficarum, a text that basically said, yes, witches are real, and yes, we should absolutely panic about them. These books described witches as flying, as traveling at night, as meeting secretly, as being far more dramatic than they likely ever were. These weren't neutral texts. They were propaganda. Fuel for fear. And once fear has a script, people start performing it. So when accused individuals described flying, they were often repeating the cultural script already written about them. It's like being trapped in a story someone else already decided. Now let's soften the tone even more. Many accused witches probably never believed they flew. They were confused, terrified, trying to survive interrogation. Some may have genuinely believed in supernatural experiences, especially if they'd had vivid dreams or visions. Others likely said whatever they thought authorities wanted to hear. And those words became history's record. But those words don't necessarily reflect real magical travel. They reflect fear, pressure, culture, and imagination. Now let's take a small detour into art again. Paintings and woodcuts from early modern Europe often show witches flying. Sometimes on brooms. Sometimes on goats. Sometimes on strange, surreal objects. These images weren't based on observation. They were based on stereotypes. Artists exaggerated features. Gave witches wild hair, crooked noses, eerie postures. And eventually, brooms became the standard accessory. Because a broom was familiar, recognizable, and visually striking. So if you wanted to signal witch, you gave her a broom. It's kind of like visual shorthand. A symbol, not a documentary. Now let's gently reflect on the emotional side. Imagine being a woman in medieval Europe. Limited rights. Limited power. Limited choices. Now imagine being accused of witchcraft. Suddenly your neighbors fear you. Authorities interrogate you. Rumors follow you. And somewhere in those rumors, people claim you fly at night. Not because you actually do, but because fear loves exaggeration. That must have felt surreal, and frightening, and deeply unfair. The myth of broom flight didn't empower these women. It often endangered them. Which gives the whole story a quiet sadness. Now let's slowly float toward a broader realization. The broomstick flight myth is less about magic, and more about how societies handle anxiety. When people feel powerless, they invent powerful enemies. When life feels uncertain, they invent supernatural explanations. And when they fear difference, they label it as danger. So witches flying on brooms tells us more about medieval fear than medieval reality. Now imagine the gradual evolution of the myth. At first, a whisper. She has strange dreams. Then, a rumor. She travels at night. Then, a legend. She flies through the air. Then, a stereotype. All witches fly on brooms. And finally, a pop culture icon. It's a slow transformation. Not dramatic. Just cumulative. Like dust collecting over centuries. Now let's soften into another small scene. A medieval storyteller sits by a fire, telling children tales, adding details to keep them listening. Some say witches fly on brooms, he murmurs. Children widen their eyes. They repeat it at home. Parents repeat it to neighbors. And suddenly, a bedtime story becomes a cultural belief. Stories shape reality more than we like to admit. Now let's gently connect this to modern times. Today, we still picture witches with brooms. In movies. In books. In decorations. But most people no longer believe it literally. It's become playful. Stylized. Almost cozy. Which is a strange transformation. A symbol once tied to fear. Now used for costumes and cartoons. The same broom. But a very different emotional tone. Fear faded. Myth softened. Story remained. Now, before we drift onward, let's sit with one final thought. Witches probably didn't fly on brooms. But people believed they might. And that belief shaped laws, trials, art, and stories for centuries. The real magic wasn't flight. It was imagination. Sometimes kind. Sometimes cruel. Sometimes simply misunderstood. Hey guys, tonight we're drifting into the warm, sandy quiet of ancient Egypt. So dim the lights. Get comfortable. Let your breathing slow, like the Nile moving at a lazy, unhurried pace. Tonight's story isn't about epic pyramids or dramatic curses. Instead, we're talking about something softer. Something oddly tender. Something a little weird, a little tragic, and strangely sweet. We're talking about pets. Specifically, mummified pets. Because ancient Egyptians didn't just mummify pharaohs. They mummified animals. A lot of animals. Cats. Dogs. Monkeys. Ibises. Falcons. Even crocodiles. And sometimes, they treated those animals like family. Other times, like religious offerings. And occasionally, like sacred snacks for the afterlife. Which is very on brand for ancient Egypt. So let's slowly float into their world. Ancient Egyptians believed deeply in the afterlife. They imagined it as a continuation of life on earth. Same needs. Same comforts. Same routines. Just with more eternity and fewer taxes. To live well in the afterlife, a person needed their body preserved. Hence, mummification. But humans weren't the only ones who deserved preservation. Animals played a huge role in Egyptian life. Some were working animals. Some were sacred symbols. Some were companions. And some were all three. Let's start with cats. Cats in ancient Egypt were basically celebrities. They protected grain from rodents. They symbolized grace, protection, and divine energy. They were associated with the goddess Batet, who represented home, fertility, and a kind of cozy spiritual energy. So when a family cat died, it wasn't just sad. It could be a full-blown emotional event. Some families mourned their cats deeply. They held funerals. They shaved their eyebrows as a sign of grief. Because of course they did. And sometimes, they mummified their beloved pet. Picture it. A household saying goodbye to a small, elegant animal that once slept near their fire. They wrap the body in linen. Maybe place it in a tiny coffin. Maybe add amulets. Maybe whisper a prayer. They weren't just preserving a pet. They were preserving companionship for eternity. It's strangely touching. But, it's not always that sentimental. Because Egypt also mummified animals on an industrial scale. Millions of animal mummies have been found. Not just pets, but animals bred specifically to be sacrificed and offered to temples. In some cases, people bought animal mummies as religious offerings. Like spiritual souvenirs. Want to honor Batet? Buy a mummified cat. Want to please Thoth? Offer an ibis mummy. Want to connect with Sobek? A crocodile mummy will do nicely. So some animal mummies were sacred companions. And others were mass-produced religious tokens. Two very different emotional vibes. Now let's float back to pets specifically. Dogs were also cherished. Some were hunting companions. Some guarded homes. Some were simply loyal friends. There are tomb paintings showing dogs sitting beside their owners. There are inscriptions naming dogs, giving them identities, personalities. And when these dogs died, some were mummified and buried with their owners. Because what's the afterlife without your loyal sidekick? You can almost imagine an Egyptian thinking, I'm not going into eternity alone. Bring my dog. And honestly, that's relatable. There are also mummified monkeys. Yes. Pet monkeys. Ancient elites sometimes kept monkeys as exotic companions. They were symbols of status, entertainment, and mild chaos. If you owned a monkey, you were basically flexing your wealth. And when those monkeys died, some were mummified too. Which is both fascinating and slightly amusing. Now let's talk about the religious side again, but gently. Many animals weren't just pets. They were considered manifestations of gods. Cats equals Batet. Falcons equals Horus. Ibises equals Thoth. Crocodiles equals Sobek. Bulls equals Apis. So when an animal died, it could be treated almost like a divine being. Some temples even kept sacred animals alive as living symbols of gods. When they died, they were mummified with elaborate care. Lavish wrappings. Decorated coffins. Rituals. Offerings. Not because they were someone's pet, but because they were holy. Still, it creates this gentle emotional blur between pet, symbol, and sacred being. Now let's talk about crocodiles. Because yes, Egyptians mummified crocodiles. Crocodiles were feared, respected, and associated with the god Sobek. Some were kept in temple pools, fed, decorated, treated like divine reptiles. When they died, they were mummified, sometimes even adorned with jewelry, which is a strangely elegant fate for a large, ancient reptile. Now let's slow down and think about the practical side. Mummifying animals required effort, time, resources, skilled workers. They wrapped small cats in linen like tiny burritos. They crafted coffins shaped like animals. They painted faces onto mummy cases. Someone had to sit there, carefully wrapping a cat paw, aligning linen strips, making sure the face looked dignified. It's a strangely tender job, even if the animal was mass-produced. The process still involved human care. Now imagine a pet owner visiting a temple, buying a mummified animal as an offering, placing it reverently, praying for blessings. To them, it might feel meaningful, personal, spiritual, even if the animal itself had never been their pet. Religion and emotion intertwined. Now let's gently drift into something slightly darker, but still calm. Not all animal mummies were full or intact. Some contained only partial remains. Some contained bones. Some contained feathers. And some contained almost nothing. In some cases, demand for mummified animals was so high that suppliers cut corners, wrapping empty bundles, or using minimal remains. Because even ancient religious markets had supply issues. But to worshippers, the symbolism mattered more than biological accuracy. Now let's return to actual pet burials. Some wealthy Egyptians buried their pets in tombs alongside them. Cats curled near feet. Dogs laid at the side. Sometimes with tiny coffins and inscriptions. Names were carved. Sentiments expressed. Simple messages like, "My beloved cat. My faithful dog." That suggests genuine affection. These weren't just religious objects. They were loved companions. And there's something gently emotional about that. Even thousands of years later, people loving their pets feels familiar. Now let's talk about how pets fit into the Egyptian vision of the afterlife. They imagined a paradise where they could farm, feast, and relax. They wanted comfort, familiarity, routine. Having a beloved animal there would make eternity feel less lonely. So mummifying pets wasn't just about ritual. It was about continuity. Keeping family together, even across death. Now let's pause on a mental image. A quiet Egyptian tomb. Soft torchlight. Wall paintings of daily life. And in a corner, a small, wrapped animal mummy. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just quietly present. A reminder that even ancient elites had soft spots. Now let's gently float toward how archaeologists discovered these mummies. In modern times, excavators have found entire cat cemeteries. Rooms filled with stacked mummies. Some carefully wrapped. Some roughly prepared. In some locations, thousands of animal mummies were discovered in a single site. Which tells us this wasn't rare. It was widespread. Cultural. Systematic. And yet, some of those animals were likely once beloved pets. Which makes the scene feel oddly bittersweet. Now let's soften again. Ancient Egyptians weren't just obsessed with death. They were obsessed with continuity. Memory. Preservation. They wanted life to go on. With as little interruption as possible. So if you loved your cat in life, why not bring it into eternity? It's not morbid. It's sentimental. Now imagine a wealthy Egyptian noble. He lounges in his villa. His cat curls near his chair. His dog follows him around. His monkey steals snacks. Years later, those animals rest beside him in a tomb. A strangely domestic version of immortality. Now let's gently reflect on the contrast. To modern eyes, mummifying pets might feel strange, excessive, or even unsettling. But emotionally, it's not so different from modern pet cemeteries. Memorials, urns, photographs, different methods, same impulse, love, attachment, grief. Ancient Egyptians just took it to a very linen-wrapped extreme. Now let's slowly drift toward what this says about their society. They valued animals as symbols, workers, offerings, and companions. They blurred lines between sacred and personal. They ritualized grief. They preserved memory. Their pet mummies weren't just curiosities. They were reflections of belief, affection, and culture. And they show us something quiet and human about a civilization often portrayed as mysterious and severe. They loved their animals. Sometimes tenderly. Sometimes symbolically. Sometimes commercially. But love was in the mix. Now let's let that thought settle. The idea that behind pyramids, hieroglyphs, and golden masks, there were people cuddling cats, walking dogs, and spoiling monkeys. And wanting those animals with them forever.